we're going to record this so that if you want it, and especially my Patreon people, they want to share it, they can share it, because very few people were as close to John as Karin was, and he was just such a special human being. I met him at a conference for the first time, and I to come to I asked him to come to Italy, and I asked him would he speak for a very young group of people. And you saw on the newsletter, if you saw, that they were all under the age of 26, all of these people, and they had formed a group called Gauss. You know, they were basically having their own little conference, but when they could have John Mack, the room was totally filled. And John was very moved by the fact that he was speaking to people that young. So he flew into Rome. Now I'm going to tell this because he was so flexible. He flew into Rome. I picked him up. I wanted him to see Rome, but I didn't want him to have to walk it all. So I got a taxi, and I had the taxi stop at I had the taxi stop in front of the Vatican so that he could see the Vatican. And I had him, you know, I was working at the American Overseas Schools, so he was at home with my mother, and he saw the Vatican. He walked back into the taxi. He stayed at home while at my apartment in Rome, which was near the Vatican. And then I came home from school, and I have to tell this, and I think he's okay with it. And he was very serious talking to my mom. And I said, John, what happened? And he said, I was pickpocketed. They took my cell phone and my digital camera. And he had gone to the forum, and he had taken beautiful pictures with his digital camera. And he didn't realize when he got on the metro that somebody had stolen his cell phone. Well, that's major, because he had no way of communicating with Massachusetts, with Boston. But what I didn't know until we got to Florence, that young group of people, those kids that had invited him to Florence, was that the taxi driver had stolen $1,000 from his wallet. So he lost $1,000. He lost his cell phone, and he lost his digital camera with all his precious pictures. So I watched this man, and I watched his reaction in it, and I've never seen anything like it. He let it go. He actually let it go. He did ask me if there was a psychic that I knew around so he could find out where his $1,000 went. I did look around for somebody that could, you know, give him an idea. And there was the wife of somebody, and what she said to him was that it happened at the taxi. But when I had told the taxi to stop so he could run around and see the beginning, you know, the beautiful columns of St. Peter's, the guy had taken the money. So I have to talk about him as a person. So it didn't last. I mean, that's major. You go to a foreign country, they take your cell phone, $1,000 and all your pictures of the forum and everything. He didn't hold on to that. And I was totally surprised when he let it go and lived in the moment. And Karin, you can add more to that. He let it go and lived in the moment. What he did, which I couldn't believe, was spend enormous amounts of time with individual people. I saw Peter just came on from Australia, and he wants to talk about John, because John stayed at his house in Australia, and we'll do that in the second hour. But he would spend, like when he was talking to you, you were the only person in the planet. I don't think I ever met a person who was as intense at listening to every word you said. Whether it was just to ask you how you were doing, or to ask you your story or to ask you something about yourself. He was there. He was present. It was what he did the best, and he did it. I never saw like intense emotion around it or anything. What I did see is the group, the young kids, they had a special dinner for him, and two of his interpreters are very famous people. One of them ran a magazine, Nexus. The other one was a comedian that was on TV. He loved John. He was going to be his interpreter too. I ended up being his interpreter also. And we were all at dinner, and he said to me, Paula, don't you think I should be speaking to the kids? I said, don't you want to finish your dinner? He said, no, let me stand up and just talk to these kids. It was like that was the most important thing of all to him. And so I understood that everybody loved him because he was a people person. He was an intense people person. And what he talked to me about was the changing of his mind, the how he began working with this. He's a psychiatrist, so he's a medical doctor, risking his whole entire career because he realized that this needed to be addressed. And so he went from that to the most beautiful speech. It's in my new book. This is the old one, uh, Connecting the Dots. And I recorded every word of it because he's one of the first people that ever used the phrase, we need to change our world view to accommodate this phenomena, not to shove this phenomena into an antiquated scientific, and I don't know what science is going to prove UFOs are real. I don't know which science, where they're going there. But instead of shoving it into a box, an antiquated box of our reality, he talked about changing our worldview, and that was going to be his main focus from now on. In other words, telling a whole bunch of people, you got to change your mind because it isn't what you think it is. Reality is not what you think it is. It was easier to do it with those kids, very much easier to do it with them because they already were very flexible mentally. But the speech in my book is, look, if we're able to change our worldview, we could accommodate this reality and maybe make some communication and not be, and he used the words right there, the virus of the universe. And I was like in shock because I had to do the interpreting. You know, I was sitting there at the table and I'm going, we're the virus. I never heard anybody call us the virus of the universe. It was basically that we were the greatest ever. You know, this species is so fantastically great that was the only one created by God and all this stuff. But this man was able to phrase something that all serious researchers that are working with consciousness can really deal with, because what he did was say, look, we need to change our way of thinking. And even Colonel Corso, when I worked with him, he said to me, we need a new science. Colonel Corso said our science is not adequate for anything that we're dealing with right now. So it's like we need to create mentally a new environment to accommodate a new reality. And the reality is like onion layers. It keeps opening and opening and opening, and we find out new things and new things. And so I love this guy. I love John Mack. I spent hours with him even in Massachusetts. He invited me to go on vacation in Newport. I spent very many hours, and I realized then that he probably was the best spokesman for this phenomenon. And I had invited him to come to Rimini, and that's when, and I think is it 2004, Karin, that the accident happened?
Yeah.
And so
September 27.
Yeah, I had already invited him to this conference. And since I had taken him to Florence, and since I had walked the streets with him, and I saw that he was just mesmerized by the Pitti Palace and all the beautiful architecture. and I saw him walk in the middle of the street, I personally took my arm and pushed him back on the sidewalk several times. Not because there were a lot of cars, there were a lot of motorcycles. In Italy, there's a lot of what we call motorini or motorcycles, and he wasn't paying attention, so he was very distracted. But I'm going to let Karin talk to you about, what happened to John. I mean, I think, and I feel, because I was with him on those streets, that this accident was an accident. I also found out from Russell Targ, though, that I didn't know this, that he had been working with Russell Targ's son-in-law, because Russell lost his daughter to cancer, on Life After Death and Messages Life After Death. And Russell told me, because Mark, the son-in-law, was working. I don't know what happened to that manuscript that they were working on together, but at one point John said to Mark, I could do a better job from the other side. And I said, oh my God, that's like psychic, knowing. The characteristics of listening, kindness, compassion, intellectuality, being able to articulate what you think, but mostly his devotion to young people. Because Karin, when you begin to talk, tell them how old you were. Because it isn't like, it's like our field is filled with older people, but he saw something in the younger generation that could transcend what our hard and fast thinking was. And he's one of the very, very few people in my field that I absolutely adored and loved. And I'm not going to tell you how hard it was on me when I found out, but the fact that I could connect with Karin, and the fact that my archives are also at Rice University. I've shipped like 8 boxes to them. And Jacques Vallée's archives are there, Whitley Strieber's archives are there, and I found out they gave them Wendell Stevens's work too at Rice. Makes me feel that there is a level of academic seriousness to our work, John's, mine, Jacques, Whitley's, and everybody. So I thought I would share that with you, as I was sitting in the audience when Karin did her speech at Rice University in May, very moved. And of course, she was very moved too, because this is so very important that you all know about this. So Karin, I hope you take over, but how old were you when you met John and when you came to Italy?
I would have been in my late 20s, probably. It depends on exactly what year it is. It's somewhere between 99 and 2001. I forget the exact date. But yeah, late 20s. I'm 55 now, so it was almost 30 years ago.
And talk about, you can begin to talk about how you met him and and even your story.
So when I'm thinking when I met him, this is why I'm thinking it's close to 30 years. I met him, I think, in 96. So are you handing the talking stick over to me? Is that what's happening now? So I want to say that, just so you guys know, that I will do my best to give a relatively succinct narrative here. I think, Paola, you've done a really fantastic job, actually, of hitting the highlights of who John was. I think there's not a single word that you said that I disagree with. I think you connected with many parts of the essence of who John was and what his strengths were. He was a very warm, kind, compassionate man, a brilliant intellect. And as Paola says, when he was present with people, he made everyone feel like there was nothing, nobody else in the world in that moment but the person who was sitting in front of him. So because of that, you know, I think there are not th I think I know that there are people all around the world who knew John and felt that they had a very close relationship with him in various different ways. And I think that that's actually true. You know, John was loved by many people. He loved people, many people in return. And he had unique and special and valued relationships with a lot of people around the planet. So I just happened to be one of those people. And because of fate or karma or whatever it might be, I ended up being someone who was a unique person in the chain of events that unfolded around his death. So Paola, because you've done such a good job, I think, introducing him, it makes a lot more sense for me to kind of just give a little bit of background about how I came into relationship with him. And I'm not going to spend, just so you guys know, time talking about my experiences or any of the specifics around that. I've sort of been down that road before. You know, my work now is much more about the kind of the nuts and bolts, chop wood, carry water of how we work with these archives and what we can do to continue the work that John started many, many years ago. So I would like to try to tell that narrative as, like I said, as succinctly as possible, so that we can open up for questions and dialogue, because that's way more interesting to me than hearing myself drone on for ages and ages. So if that's okay with everyone, I'll just start with how I met him. The very, very high level overview is that I'm trying to think of dates here, but in my mid-20s, my early to mid-20s, I started having conscious encounters, physical abduction encounters that were classic to the narrative, the kind of individuals that John was working with. And I'm going to compress a lot very, very quickly here. I went through the most challenging and, as John would say, ontologically shocking of those events repeatedly over the course of about 6 months. And by the time that I got to a place of not really being able to hold space with it anymore, without it somehow demonstrating its ontological status as at least being able in some moments to appear in reality, in a reality that I understood, the phenomenon obliged and gave me a very, very conscious encounter that for me sealed the deal. It's an experience of several that I will take to my grave, and there's no one who can convince me that I didn't have a real physical interaction with an advanced non-human intelligence. And because that event happened on the course, you know, after I had been having these encounters for, like I said, about 6 months, I finally got to this place with it that I recognized that I was experiencing something real, that I was being exposed to technology and concepts of physics that fall far outside of our paradigm, the scientific materialist paradigm. And I realized that I needed to get some help to try to help metabolize and understand, make sense of what was happening to me. So I actually started out with SETI and NASA. I was that persuaded of what was happening. They, of course, laughed at me and and assumed I was a nut job and were not helpful at all. I then tried to look in somewhere else in the US government to see if there was some other organization that might be helpful. Of course, there wasn't. I somehow got referred on to MUFON. I went to a local MUFON meeting and found a bunch of retirees who were mostly just, I think, retired Navy pilots, just guys, these old guys who were talking about the nuts and bolts of UFOs at the time. And of course, they didn't have anything or want anything to do with what I was dealing with. So I kind of snuck out the back after about 15 minutes and started looking for help closer to home. I opened up what was then the Yellow Pages at the time. I'm old enough to remember that. And I looked for I looked for, I think, a hypnotist, someone who might be able to help me recover more details of what had occurred, and found someone who promised that he could help me quit smoking and he could help me lose weight if I wanted to, and he could surely help make the space aliens go away as well. And I knew fairly quickly that that was obviously not the right solution either. And so I finally found what seemed like a very open-minded psychotherapist who was also a licensed hypnotherapist. And I went to her, and we got about 15 minutes into our first proper session. And she stopped it, walked out of the room, got what was then the DSM-4, and opened it up to a page called Temporary Psychosis, pointed to it, said, "That's you. Here's a script. I recommend that you go get the script filled right now and take these antipsychotics." So it was very disheartening and distressing to be, pathologized, that fast. And of course, I said, "Thank you very much," wadded the script up and threw it in the trash as I walked out of her office. And that's when I started trying to open up my search area again and try to figure out who could be helpful, and discovered John. I think he had written the book Abduction by then. I read the book Abduction and it resonated. And I appreciated his very scientific approach. Abduction reads like, just a clinical study of a number of different case studies of people who have had these encounters. And John and I ended up getting connected through a series of very synchronistic events, which this is a story too long to tell for now. But suffice it to say, I ended up in his office at the end of '96 or beginning of '97. And I was probably only about 8 months into my encounters then. And he and I just hit it off right from the beginning. And he was immediately helpful. He was incredible at opening up a space of non-judgment in a session and allowing the high strangeness of the narratives to emerge, to come forward, while making it safe for that to happen. So for perfectly sane people who are talking to another sane adult about aliens coming and abducting them, it's a really embarrassing thing to talk about. It's a very painful thing to talk about in the beginning, and one can do a lot of self-editing and trying not to be, perceived as too strange or in some way mentally disturbed. And he just wasn't bothered at all by the strangeness of it. By then he had clearly already, spoken to a lot of Bud Hopkins experiencers, and he had been working with his own experiencers. So he was quite comfortable, again, creating a safe space to allow me, in this case, to process what was happening. And I worked with him for about 2 to 3 years while the encounters continued. And like so many other people at the end of the last century, so the end of the 20th century, the encounters stopped. And I was told that when I was in the middle of the last encounter, I was told that it was going to be the last interaction, and it was. And for all of the experiencers that I know who are having those very physical encounters at the time, they were told in various different moments about their last interaction as well. And indeed, that turned out to be the case for them too. So the project that was going on at the time in the late 70s, 80s, 90s really reached its culmination and conclusion by the turn of the century. And as far as I know, I don't know of anyone who's having contact right now that has anything to do with physical abductions, being taken into these strange exotic environments with curvilinear walls and strange beings who perform, reproductive procedures. Like, that's just not happening right now. I think there are a lot of people who are having various different kinds of contact, but it tends to have more to do with consciousness and various different, I think, easier ways to be connected to these intelligences. So we stopped working together in that research capacity as the encounters came to a close. And over the course of a year or so, our relationship evolved into a friendship. And then it eventually evolved into my becoming a his personal assistant. And I, through a series of events, ended up moving into his very large home and help manage his house, because he used to have a lot of visitors come in that needed to be just organized and dealt with while they were there. And then he had a lot of other just personal support that he needed at the time. So I had a paid position, in, where was I? I'm like 2000, so now we're in 2004, and I had been working with him in that capacity for probably about a year and a half. But it was sort of a mix between this this professional assistance that I was giving him, as well as this a relationship that had involved in kind of the family that you adopt along the way. So we had sort of adopted each other, and he was prone to do that. He had adopted other friends in his life. So again, this is not about me being special in a particular way. It's just an issue of timing that I ended up being in his house. This is where I get my heart. One day I think I'll be able to get through this without getting teary. I'm sorry. I was living in John's house and living with him at the time of his death. I was the one to drop him off at the airport for his last visit to England. And I was due to pick him up the next day. And of course, found out that he had, in his way, walked into the street and had not looked the right direction, just as Paola had said. He was very much a sort of stereotypical professor in the sense that he was very much in his head often. He was very tired. He was tired before he left for the trip, and he was jet lagged over there and had a long day and dinner and several glasses of wine, and he just wasn't altogether there, clearly. So very heartbreaking to lose him like that. It was shocking, and as Paola said, it was sort of indescribable. It's a traumatic loss. I was not expecting it, and it took me probably 4 or 5 years to get through the emotional cycle that comes with that kind of, the grief that comes with that kind of loss. But in the moment, like in the days following his departure, I learned that death is, as much as it is a grieving process, it is also a business for someone who has had the kind of life that John led. So he had an estate that needed to be closed down, and his family members asked that I stay on to help close that estate. And so I did. And I was in his house for about 9 months following his untimely, or maybe timely, departure, depending on how one thinks about how things unfold in the universe. But I ended up being responsible for getting his archives together at home. His admin he had 2 admins at work. One was Will Boucher, another was Pat Carr, who had been with him for probably 30 plus years at that point. The 3 of us brought all of his archives and got them ready for storage. So Pat and Will took care of the professional archives, and then I had all the archives at home that had anything to do really with the phenomenon. And as we got everything together and put it into storage, I left the house to be sold to his family and went off radar for about 20 years until COVID hit. And all of the archives sat in storage for that entire period of time, undisturbed. And then as COVID hit, after I had been running a business for probably about 15 years, it became really clear that I was being knocked out of that track, which was painful at the time. I wasn't expecting it. I was running a design build general contracting business that was very healthy and in a development mode still. And I had nothing to do with this phenomenon at the time. I was just had been allowing myself to integrate the reality of what those experiences had been and how they impacted me. And it just became very clear that once I left my business and got still and thought about what it was that I was going to be doing with the rest of my life, it became very clear I was not going to be returning to this profession that I had been developing for all that time, and in fact was now being called to return to this work. And somewhere towards the end of 2020, I just got this download of inspiration for a plan to reanimate John's Institute. And I approached his eldest son, Danny Mack, who has been one of the ones holding the 501c3 that was John's organization. He's kept it alive for all of these years. And I presented my proposal to Danny to reanimate the organization, and Danny approved it. And so I have been working for the past couple of years behind the scenes to explore what work needs to be continued in the, in what work is incomplete from John's departure. And we've discovered that a lot of it has to do with the archives itself right now. And namely, that is that in the collection of archives that has gone to Rice University, which is everything that has to do with the phenomenon. So that's going to be anything from the 1990s, essentially, move until the time of his death. Anything that was before the 1990s and really represents the work, his clinical work that he did at Harvard, all of those boxes, all of those materials are going to be homed at Harvard University. At Rice University, where all of the materials related to the phenomenon are, we have discovered that we have 4 discrete, and maybe even a 5th collection of materials that have within them, have latent within them the raw data of John's research. And what we're intent on doing in collaboration with Jeff Kripal's project at Archives of the Impossible and the Woodson Research Center at Rice University, led by Amanda Foki. The 3 of us have started a metadata research project that will utilize AI and other human resources to surface the raw data that is resting in these different collections, so that we can get the overarching repeated themes that appear and reappear in the collection, sans any interpretation by John. And as we develop the methodology and protocols to lift that information and make sense of it, we will be integrating other credible researchers' work from around the globe who also are carrying comparable collections. Now, asterisk there, I'm personally biased because of having worked with John and having seen how they handled the materials. I think John's materials are in many ways in a category, a class all by themselves. John was at the time in a class all by himself, and the amount of effort that his organization put into very carefully screening the individuals that were presenting themselves for assistance, I think is sort of unparalleled, compared to other researchers in the field. So we have this very, very high quality, clinically supervised tranche of information related to the work that John did. But we also recognize that David Jacobs' work, Bud Hopkins' work, Barbara Lamb, Kathleen Martin, Gilda Mora, there's, people who have worked with experiencers all around the globe whose materials are holding similar raw data. So our long-term intent for this research, this meta data research project, is to engage other researchers and have them donate, at least for the period of time, for us to lift of data out of their archives. We want to apply the same protocols to them so that we can get this global oversight of what experiencers have said collectively has happened to them, what, again, what these repeated themes are. And as we get that data lifted, and by the way, we intend to do all of this with the oversight of an interdisciplinary panel of elite academics. So our methodologies and protocols will be approved in advance, And we will at last have the statistics that we can offer in a way that's acceptable to science and academia, and we'll have white papers written on it so that the percentage of academics and scientists who do actually want to work with this phenomenon, it turns out there's quite a few, if they that do want to work on it, as long as they could be guaranteed that they're not going to, jeopardize their professional standing in any way. When we lift the data and present it like this gives them an opportunity to seriously do the research on it and make sense out of what they see. And again, this is meant to be an interdisciplinary approach to it. So that for me is and for what GEMI is becoming is our current and most important work. Because as I learned, and as many other experiencers have learned over the course of the past 20 to 30 years, it matters not how many of us stand up and tell these really profound and profoundly compelling narratives to any audience, small or big. Our narratives on their own are not enough to persuade science and academia, or generally speaking, the mainstream public, that we have actually experienced something that has veracity in an ontological reality that is actually familiar to most of us. And I'm convinced, as are a lot of other people that we're working with right now, that if we can sort of get this material and pass it on to science and academia, that is finally going to clear the blockage that we've been experiencing for the past few decades around this. Because once these folks start talking about it and taking it seriously, then they impact the larger cultural conversation, and we can start having this dialogue out in the mainstream without so much tongue-in-cheek and snickering and all of the ridicule that comes along with it. So that's where I'm at with it right now. It's not sexy work. Sometimes it's just about pulling staples and scanning papers in, but it's for me the most important work that I could be doing with my life right now. And of course, I'm doing my best to achieve a level of excellence in everything that we're doing and work with people whose academic and professional excellence aligns with the level of excellence that John embodied in the work that he did as well. So that's the backstory. I think that's probably my introduction, and I'm of course happy to entertain any questions and take the conversation anywhere anyone would like to go now. Paola, do you have anything you want to say?
You left your house in Norway, your husband.
Yeah.
You left New Year.
You want me to talk about that?
Still here.
So
and we're yes, so what she's done, and it's really interesting, is she's dedicated her life to do this. But she had another job like for 10 or 15 years before that. And I've talked to Karin about this, because when I was in Houston and she was speaking about him to this audience, he was physically there. I felt him there. I don't know, Karin, if you did, but he was there. He was like, yay, you got it together. I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad somebody's doing this, because it's very important. And what I'd like to, I know people have questions, but before everybody, has a hand raised, do you see where the hand raise is on the bottom? It says reactions, and then there's a hand. I want to introduce from Australia, because he's been waiting to talk to you, Peter Curry. Now, I interviewed Peter Curry because of a book called The Hair of the Alien. And Peter, don't go on too much detail, but I hope people buy The Hair of the Alien because of your encounter. There was actually DNA evidence. But, I had talked to you earlier. He's with us from Australia because John actually slept at his house. He actually, he actually was very good friends with him and slept at his house. And I'm looking at, I think it's Galaxy. Do you have a way of weighing in, Peter? Can you talk?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there he is. You say hi to
Yeah,
Karin.
yeah. So I just want to say, hearing Paola and Karin talk, it's like we've all been through very, very similar experiences with John, and they're uncannily. Um, I can't believe how close they are, um, and I can relate to him being so busy and a lot of thoughts in his head that sometimes crossing the road, yeah, John would look the wrong way. And being from America coming to Australia, that played a big role because we drive on the wrong side, other side of the road to you guys. And just quickly, I'll just throw it. We went out to dinner one night, and as we were crossing the road, John was walking just slightly ahead of me, and it was a main road in the King's Cross area, and a van was coming past, and I had to actually grab John by the left shoulder and pull him back. I never forget it. Had a blue short sleeve shirt on too. Pulled him back away from this van, and as I pushed him back, the mirror of the van clipped John's right shoulder. And the guys pulled up, the driver and the passenger, and started screaming at John and trying to argue with him. And I stepped in and started arguing with them. And John was like, "Peter, please don't get into a fight because of me." He felt so bad. But I can see how an accident like that could have happened. And then you guys are mentioning similar things. It was just that little bit of, yeah, having a lot on his mind and being in a different country where our cars come from the wrong side. So when John looked to his left, he should have been looking to his right. But it's an easy mistake to make. But that just sent shivers down me when you guys were mentioning stuff like that. But what I want to say about John, when I met him, it was in 1996. I had Dr. Patty Barton from the Transpersonal Association in Sydney contact me and ask me. I founded support group in 1993, and it was the first support group for abductees. Um, John wanted to work with some people and have a workshop with them, and I got the phone call, and I was just like blown away that they would ask us to have a workshop with John. And when we did, we turned up to this hotel. It was called the International Pacific Hotel, and we took a photo, Bill Chalker, myself, Dominique, and John in the foyer. And I remember John saying to me as we were taking the photo, "Peter, you've chosen a really nice hotel." He said, "I'm used to, in America, we go in laneways and down basements and meet in basements. It's just hidden from everyone." It impressed him that we were in the open. We were at an international hotel, not in someone's backyard or in someone's basement. The workshop itself benefits so many people. I mean, our group had psychologists and hypnotherapists and counselors and psychologists, and had a whole number of different people involved. And everybody got a lot out of that workshop. But what I found with John on that day, I didn't discuss my story at all. I didn't talk about my experience. It was about the other people that were there. And John gave everybody his time. It wasn't like he chose certain people and spent more time with them. He spent, similar amount of times with everybody. And I was just blown away at how much empathy he had for people, and how much that he really did care. It wasn't just a research thing for John. It wasn't like, he'll write a book or a couple of books. And for John, it was more the personal change this experience has had on people. And I remember saying to me at one time, people struggle with this. He said, but maybe we're meant to struggle with something like this. Maybe when we're not meant to understand this phenomena. And it took probably on the third day, we were at dinner at one of Dominique's friends' places, and we're sitting down at dinner, and John just asked me the question. He said, "Peter, I still haven't heard about your experiences. Would you like to share them?" And I mentioned a couple of my experiences, and John said, "How would you feel about doing a regression session?" And I was like, what now? And he's, yeah, why not? And there was a psychiatrist, a female psychiatrist there as well. And John, Dominique, and the female psychiatrist sat in on on that regression. And John brought me back to my 1988 experience that happened to me with basically the Whitley Strieber communion type beings, exactly the same. And there was one stage in that experience where I see the short-looking guys, and I thought they were demons. I didn't believe in UFOs and aliens at the time. So when I saw this thing, I thought they were demons. And then I saw the taller ones, the golden colored ones with the big black eyes. And um, I was petrified when I looked at the shorter ones who looked demonic to me. And I had a background of martial arts and, a lot of training, played rugby league and sports and so on. So, I could handle myself, and I wanted to get up and throw punches at these beings that were in my room, but I was paralyzed and in total fear. And then I looked and saw the two taller guys with the big eyes. And as soon as I looked in the eyes, it was like I fell in a void. It was like they were hypnotizing me instantly, and I felt calm. And what really got John's attention was 1 second I was petrified and I was sweating. This is through the hypnosis. And then as soon as I look into the taller being's eyes and I become relaxed within seconds, he said to me, he noticed like my breathing, my blood pressure, the sweating, everything stopped. And he said, you can't fake that. You can't just stop sweating. You can't stop your heart pounding. And, I never really, we discussed my 1992 experience with the two females where I retrieved the hair samples and showed him the hair. John was one of the first people actually to see the hair and comment on it to me, and he was really impressed. But what I found with John, it wasn't really about the physical evidence that's out there. He wasn't into the land trace cases, or John was about the effect it's having on us as human beings more so, and the transpersonal change. And I understand that there's a lot of people out there doing research about physical traces and so on. And John was looking at it from a different point of view. And I respect him so much for standing up, to Harvard and to everybody else, and putting his reputation on the line. And I'll quote this. And John said to me once, Peter, I'm 60 at the time. He said, I'm 66 years old. I'm at the tail end of my career. He said, but I worry for someone like you. He said, you're young, your whole career is starting out, and I worry about the impact this is going to have on your life. Having the experience and reporting it is one thing. He said, running a support group and helping others is another. So he gave me a lot of strength and a lot of hope. And I feel privileged that I, had the time to meet him. And the couple of times that they came out to Australia, they did spend a lot of time with us. And I've got some beautiful family photos with John and my children at the Opera House and around Sydney. And I cherish those photos and those memories. And, the day that I found out what happened of John's passing, it broke my heart. And every day when I think about it, it brings a tear to my eye. I think the world lost a great man, and I appreciate what you guys are doing. And that's why I really wanted to be involved in this. I wanted to hear the work people were doing and carrying on John's work and John's name. And, and I remember Dominique suggesting to John at one stage, she said, look, we can trust Peter. Why don't you give him copies of all your files? And John was going to do that. He was going to give me copies of files to hide for him in Australia and keep records, because he was having some issues with some production company when they were going to make a movie about his life, so on, and they wanted all the research and they were demanding it and they were threatening court cases and so on. And I just felt like if he trusts me that much, like he became like a father figure to me. And I'm just blessed for knowing him. And I know that everybody that he touched and supported and listened to their stories, I know he's changed their lives forever.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Can I put you in contact with Karin so you could directly talk to her? She's still in Houston working on his archives. And so if she has questions, or if you have pictures or all of that, can I put you directly in contact with her?
Certainly, certainly. I have a picture that breaks my heart. I'm at the airport and John and Dominique are sitting opposite me, and that was the last photo that I took of John, and that was the last time I saw him in my life. And every time I look at that, it really breaks my heart.
Well,
Yeah, I
that
feel
would be great if I mean, it makes me feel good, Peter, that I connected you, because that's what my goal is the connecting people together so they work together. So Karin, I'm going to give Peter your contact info. Is that all right? And then you talk to each other and you text each other and see how maybe he could contribute something to.
Sure, we're happy to dialogue with him.
Okay, is that okay? Okay, then
Oh,
that would be great. That would be great, because she's, I told her husband is in Norway. She gave up 5 months to stay in America to work on his archives here and some more. And she needs to stay even longer. Does anybody else have any questions for Karin about John? Did anybody else know him that well? Did anybody else meet him? Okay, Joan, hang on a minute. Let me get you unmuted, or unmute yourself. Okay.
Okay. This is bringing up all the feelings too. I met John in 1999. We were back east. My husband had some business in Boston, and I was reading Abduction at the time and was blown away by it. And I'd also read the book about Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, where it compared a lot of the different researchers in the field. And out of all of them, I just felt like John was the one who just really got the significance of this whole thing that was happening. And so I went straight from that book to reading Abduction, and was in it when we were in Boston, and my husband Max had this contact who said that we could have an audience with John Mack, and I was just totally thrilled, blown away, amazed that had happened, and walked in to see him. And he was very tired. He was working on the galley proofs of Passport to the Cosmos, and he, dark circles under his eyes, and I just felt so blessed to be there. And he said, "So what are you here for?" And I said, "I am totally fascinated by the information coming from the contactees."
Recording in progress.
And he said, "So am I." And I'd been working in conservation for a number of years, and one of the things that really was blowing me away was how many of the abductees, contactees were coming back converted again to be born again conservationists and environmentalists because of what they were shown. And after that, he sent us galley proofs to Passport to the Cosmos, and I read them immediately. And there was a chapter in there called Returning to Source that it just pulled so many things together, of that divide between what's spiritual and what's physical, and realizing that it's all one, it's all part of the same continuum. And I just sobbed and sobbed when I read that chapter. And in fact, I called up a friend and said, "Can I just go sit by a creek at your cabin for a couple of days? Because this has like totally changed my understanding of the nature of reality." And he called me up to ask me how I liked the book. And I said, "John, it was life-changing for me. And I want to bring somebody to Montana," because I was doing this event called Celebrating Women, to speak. And we had Changing Women was the theme that year. And Judy Swanson was the person who ended up coming. And I know, Karin, you know her.
Yeah.
And she came out and spoke both at that event and then in the community to as many people as I could get to come out, and was wonderful, and really loved having her. And when he died, I just needed to call somebody, and I called her and asked her, what happened? Was it an accident? And she said, "I do believe it was an accident." Because she had overheard him say that he was doing this work on continuing consciousness, was what the phrase that they were using for it. And I thought it was with Russell Targ, but maybe it was the son, or Elizabeth's husband or fiance or whatever, boyfriend. And that he had said he could do this work so much more easily from the other side. So that was one of the reasons. And the other reason, she said, was that his father was killed by a truck. And she thought that was just you know, kind of an interesting, more than a coincidence.
Mhm.
So anyway, I loved him dearly. I had hoped to go and study with him.
Mm.
And was very disappointed that it didn't happen. But I have gone on to do a lot of work with contactees, and I'm starting to work on a book right now about a man who said that he was from Alpha Centauri and lived in Montana for several months in 1952, and maybe the world is ready to hear that.
Mm. John, I'm just realizing your name is familiar to me. We must have met before. I must have met you before.
I think so. I was at a number of conferences where he was, and I know whenever he spoke, he always, you know, he says, these are my co-researchers. They're not my clients. They're my co-researchers. And he always gave time to whoever he had with him.
Yeah, for sure. I'm moved by how, I'm not surprised. I shouldn't be surprised, but it's moving to me to Joan and Peter. Am I remembering your name correctly? Is that? Yes, your galaxy 310 here, but it's very moving to hear both of you speak about him, because you're both so much in your heart, and it's such a mirroring, it's a reflection of who he was. I mean, he just had that capacity to connect with people, you know, very heartfully, empathetically, and compassionately, and you know that he was such an elegant an intelligent man. He was graceful, you know, had a lot of grace as a human being as well. He was, you know, again, in a class by himself. So I appreciate you sharing your experiences with him. They connect with my heart and makes me feel him again, which is a gift.
I felt like I'd met my mission commander.
Yeah, that makes sense. It totally does.
Yeah.
Joan, it might be interesting for you on an academic level. I know you do a lot of traveling to go to Houston, to go to Rice University, to actually, you know, go where the archives are. I'm for all the people that want, I will give you Karin's information because she's still here. I don't know for how long, but she's still here.
Can I say a couple things about the archives, just for perspective? Can I just speak for just a second to this, Paola? Yeah. So just to and Peter, this is to you. When John's talking about leaving archives with you, just so you know, the scale of this there's in no reality could you have received at the time the scale of what this is. Just so you know, we had 300 bankers boxes that were full. The lightest ones have 400 documents in them. The most dense of those boxes have 2,000 documents in them, and we had 300 of those. So in order for me to complete the scanning process, it's taking a village to do it, because the scale, the amount of materials that he has is overwhelming, and it's very like sort of all meat, no bones, no fat. You know, it's very, very dense with useful information. And for what it's worth, the archives as they exist right now, if someone were to come in and try to research or make sense, particularly of the archives that are in Rice University, it's not in any form that's helpful to anybody. You can't come in and read a few letters or read some transcripts. We have HIPAA regulations right now that we have to be mindful of course. So there's a whole anonymization process that we have to go through before we can lift the data that's in there. And then the only way that we're going to get through the volume of materials that we have is by applying AI to this and training it over time. And this is why we're so determined to do this, because we want the information that's in it, you know, what John was able to capture. We want that surfaced and accessible to the public. And so just bear that in mind. If anyone's thinking about coming to Houston right now to look at the archives, it's not going to be a helpful thing. But we are at the moment, so I think I failed to say, so I'm the executive director of GEMI now. I have a core team of individuals that we're working with, including a couple of directors, and we've brought Jeff Kreipel in as a director to kind of step into the shoes that John filled. So we have a heavy hitter, academic heavy hitter that is lending gravitas to the work that we want to do. And on top of that, I'm actively in the process of building this a rather significant, I don't know, a good sized advisory board, again, interdisciplinary, so that all of the work that we're doing moving forward is under the guidance and watchful eye of these academics. And ultimately, what we're trying to do, to your point, Joan, the research is the first part of the work that we're doing at GEMI, and it's a finite amount of work. But as we move through that work, the kind of the next push of what we're trying to do is to actively create, how do we say it? Maybe the easiest way to say it is a think tank that is a home for a lot of these academics, where they can together work on the various kinds of phenomena that show up. So what does it look like to develop a new worldview? And indeed, I forgot to also mention, there is an unpublished manuscript from John called When Worldviews Collide. And right now, it needs a little bit of work still. He was at the point of handing it to his editors and his, his publicists. And everybody was giving him the kind of the same feedback on what needed to be done to it. And we've invited Jeff Kripal to finish writing that, to kind of clean up what's there, so that I would say by sometime, maybe summer latest next year, John's last book should be published posthumously. And yeah, it's really good. And Joan, the first part of the book tells the Harvard tale, the story of, nuts from soup to nuts of everything that happened in the Harvard investigation of his work. Mm-hmm. And then it moves into a second part, which is it's a reflection on how our scientific materialist worldview has, impeded us, or really stood as the main, how do we say it, challenge that we had to deal with in trying to come to terms with the ontology of what these and the phenomenology of what these encounters are. So he speaks in his poetic way in the second part of this book, kind of expounding, I think, probably on that one chapter that was particularly moving for you. So yes. Stay tuned to the John E Mack website. We are in the process of developing a new website right now, and we're going to create it in a way that we create a social platform. We attach that to it as well, so it's active and live, and people can interact with us and interact with each other as in the community, the people who are connected to John. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I have no idea when I'm going back home. My husband is having to visit me every few months, and that's where we're at right now, because this work is so important. It needs to be done. So
is it in chronological order?
Is what in chronological order? The materials?
The archives. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was immaculate. He was every bit the academic in how he kept them. So all of the materials starting in the late 70s and early 80s that belonged to any of the research he was doing on, nuclear studies. For a while, his organization was originally the Center for Psychological Studies in the Nuclear Age. You may remember that. And then it evolved into the Center for Psychology and Social Change. So everything is in alphabetical and chronological order. So they're very, very, very tidy archives. The archivists at Rice and Harvard are both super impressed with how much of their work is done for them already, because of how well John kept his materials. And, starting from it's really like 89, 90s, where there's this shift in his focus of attention, and it moves predominantly into this work. And it's clear where there's a severance, a separation between Harvard and his own work that he's wanted to do. The Harvard letterhead, crest got removed from his materials, and it became, all about what this work is. And all of it's all being digitized. I'm literally in the process of managing a team of folks who are doing that right now. We should be done with the digitization project at the end of August. And after we got a chance to do the research on it, and Rice has had a chance to fully process these materials, all of this will be made available to the public.
Mhm.
Harvard is going to do the same thing, but they have a huge backlog of this kind of work that they have to do. So I don't know, it could be 5 to 10 years before any of John's, Harvard related, his clinical materials are made available to the public. So I'm trying, and Jeff and Amanda here at Rice, we're all trying to get these materials, processed as quickly as possible so we can surface this content for everybody, not just for academics, but for mainstream research as well. We want people to have access to it as soon as possible.
Mhm.
Okay, is there anybody else that knew John that has a question for Karin? Is there anybody else that unmute yourself if you do, because I'm looking to see if anybody's raised their hand.
I'm also just curious if anyone here, like why anyone would show up for this, for this webinar, as it were. So if anyone feels inspired to say why you're here, that would be great.
Julia,
To hear.
Julia has her hand up. Hang on, Julia. There you are. Hi. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
Why don't you, Julia, go ahead, and then we'll go to Peg. Go ahead, Julia.
I never met John Mack, but from what I've heard of him, what I've read, is that he himself had an extraordinarily high worldview. And it's interesting to me that he talks about worldviews. I study patterns of consciousness, basically, and I'm struck by, it takes a high worldview to see how things are falling out worldview wise. You can't see the worldviews above you. You can only see the ones that you've already integrated. And so it's interesting how he, at this high worldview, can look at the way things are evolving in consciousness. And I just would refer people to David Hawkins' work on starting with power versus force. He was a psychiatrist who invented the map of consciousness and how people, what it looks like as you move up and how you see things. And Larry Byram's work with worldviews as well, where people are, there's safety and security, and then there's outer success. There's relationship level where there's a lot of drama. I think a lot of UFO people are in there. and then, the whole field is kind of play there a lot. There's inner success above that, where when you change how you feel and see things from the inside, when you how you show up as a true identity, everything outside of you seems to change as well, and it does change. You can call it miracles, but with doing this work creates that work. The world changes, and John Mack had that, and then he had more than that. There was, you integrate your ability to see worldviews, and then the top of the ladder in this system is world service. And I think he was pushing world service in seeing the how important it is for the whole, that his work was dedicated to the world. It's Mother Teresa, that kind of thing. You're doing something personal, like taking care of a dying person, but at the same time you're serving the entire planet, because your example is from the heart, and it's vast. It moves a lot of things on the planet just because you're doing the work you're doing. And I see him in that kind of way too. So that's why I'm here. And I just love the guy. I've never even met him, but I feel his influence.
So I would just add to that very quickly. If John were here, he would be, I really appreciate that perspective. He would add to what you said, that one of the first things he would say as he began a talk was that he would start from where he started from. So there's a line, something to the effect of, he started out, from a New York German Jewish, scientific materialist worldview. And and he was very steadfastly in that for a good portion of his life. But then there was clearly something in him, you know, his own, whatever his own soul journey, his own soul path was here, that like that was never enough. And he spent years, well before he was introduced to the phenomenon, trying to grasp, you know, a larger understanding of the universe, and having, I think, an innate instinct that there was something more. And he, in his own way, was seeking, you know, a very personal experience of that. And when he first was introduced to experiencers by Bud Hopkins, he assumed that he was going to find some kind of psychopathology, you know, present in these individuals. And he was shocked to find out that that was not the case. So I think he would be the first one to say that for that last, what was it? So if we say from 1990 to, so the last 15 years of his, you know, 14, 15 years of his life, that, you know, Joan, to your point, that he was educated by the experiencers and by the phenomenon, and then he took it and ran with it. And you're right, he was absolutely in service for his entire life, and to watch how his worldview evolved and changed, you know, over the course of time, you know, it was indicative of a very facile, you know, mind, and he had a very unique intelligence that I think at its core was about a heart and mind coherence, which is not always the case. You know, oftentimes people are very, very intelligent and the heart's not online. So I think that's one of the things that made John, you know, particularly special and uniquely qualified to do, you know, the work that he was doing. So
the Sufis say that you know, you begin to have this expansion when your head drops into your heart. You know,
yeah.
that your thinking becomes informed by your heart. That moves it forward. I also noticed in my own, you know, studies that right in the 1990s, right around 92, you know, right the mid 90s, there was a huge movement in consciousness all around the world, in books and writings. It's just an explosion of awareness of it. Sometimes it was called ascension, or sometimes it was called descension, when the divine dropped into form. You know, we became embodying our own divinity, you know, and becoming aware of that. That was a period when that happened. It's very interesting that that's when he felt this shift happened in him too. It was a worldwide thing that occurred right in that time frame, and has only gotten more expanded since, but it was dramatically shifting.
So the one thing I would add to what a couple of you have mentioned in terms of how he oriented, you know, that this sort of, like, he was an advocate for this third realm of like consciousness and reality. Like, he and I would tussle around this, because I was very persuaded that this had an element of it that had, and Peter, I suspect you would agree with this, that there's certain parts of the encounters that are very physical. Like they're not, it's not just this altered kind of experience of reality. It manifests in certain moments, or it did in our physical reality. And the benefit that we have right now, one of the other things that we're doing very quietly on the side, is we're actually actively working with physicists at the moment to and with how do I say it, connecting experiencers with physicists to try to reconcile some of the knowledge and information that experiencers have with new thinking around physical models of the universe that have implicit within them an interconnectivity of everything. So it's, you know, the main model at the moment that we're working with is something called direct particle interaction, and this particular model allows for the high strangeness of the phenomena that occurs with a lot of these encounters. So I suspect it's only a matter of time, maybe the next 5 to 10 years, whatever, that before these alternative models for the universe and potentially alternative worldviews start to emerge. And John is absolutely in the DNA of all of that happening, for sure.
You know, Clodagh, you have not said anything. She's from British Columbia. Do you have a question? unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks, Karen. I think I'd like to acknowledge how important it is for the work that you're doing to organize that information and analyze it with various AI models to tease out patterns. And because I think, you know, we all know the phenomenon, it transcends cultures. And I think we need to get past the current abduction model that kind of predominates in the United States, and start to incorporate other models that are represented in different parts of the world. And I think that context is really important too. So for instance, when you went through your experience, if you feel like sharing, what was going down in your life at that time? Your mid-20s, that's early to mid-20s, that's a really intense time. And so if we can sort of incorporate the context of the life of that person, or the culture they're living in, the country, so on and so forth, and plug that into that AI model, we can probably garner a lot of information that could perhaps lead humanity on a more wise path than it's otherwise taking.
So I have two thoughts to that. One is a thought and a question. To your point, the reason that we want to have an interdisciplinary academic panel, you know, providing the oversight, is precisely for this sort of thought or perspective that you've just come up with. We want to make sure that the queries that we develop for the AI to apply to these materials takes those kind of questions into consideration. So we have academics from the humanities, as you know, as well as from the sciences as well, because each, as you can imagine, each discipline thinks about this phenomenon from their perspective, and every perspective is valuable and needed. So it's you're right in the terrain there, and those are exactly the kind of questions that we want to you know, feed to the AI so that we can see it. And precisely the reason why we also want to make this an international effort as well, because the kind of experiences they have in Central and South America are very different than the ones that we have here, and sometimes vary from the ones from indigenous cultures, as we know, whether it's, you know, Native people in in North America relating to them as star people versus, you know, African cultures, which relate to them as another word that I'm not thinking of right at the moment. So it's important to get this high level overview of it. So but the question that I have for you, if you're willing to expound on it a little bit more, is about, in your mind, when you're curious about the context in which these physical encounters occurred, what is it that you're linking there, or particularly curious about, or what hypothesis do you have there?
Well, for instance, in my own experience, I had a very unusual experience at the age of 3, and at the time I was living in Nipua, Manitoba, and it was only after probably close to 40 years, no, probably more than that actually, and getting in touch with an old friend from Nipua, Manitoba, who confirmed that she'd actually seen a silver disc over the neighbor's house in 1975, which would have coincided with the Grant Cameron Charlie Red Star flap. Well, my own experience in 1968 coincided with stuff that was going down at the Minot Air Force Base, which was around the nuclear silos. Yeah. And I don't know if myself and my family were just, you know, in that flight pathway, and they just thought, oh, let's go and check out the natives. Or if it was linked in with family lineage, I don't know. I'm Irish, right? So I've got that Irish DNA, and the part of Ireland that my mother's family come from, which is Leitrim Roscommon, has a pretty high incidence of phenomenon. So I find all that stuff really, really fascinating. And then, so the whole nuclear
Right.
angle, I helped Paula and Jacques with their book. I did some transcription, and it really resonated with me because of the nuclear angle, which I feel is very significant. And it's very significant that at this time, certain people are trying to downplay Paula's book. Everybody take notice of that. I think that's not by accident. And I'm a victim. No, I wouldn't call myself a victim, but I'm a survivor of thyroid cancer. So there's just so many synchronicities that I really don't feel it was an accident that I met Paula. And I grew up in Nipua, Manitoba, and I had these experiences. So that's the context. That's it's so intricate. And it's taken me like over 40 years to figure this out. So if you have that AI model, holy smokes, man, you can really make and draw a lot of inferences quickly, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking time to share that. That's precisely the point. And for what it's worth, and by the way, I'm dog sitting here right now, and the dog is pacing a lot, so I may have to pause for a moment and let him outside. So just bear with me if I have to do that. But to piggyback on what you just said, yes, it's precisely that kind of context that we want to surface. Like you say, it's very nuanced. It doesn't just seem to happen in the vacuum. You know, like what are the correlations that are occurring? So, you know, I had the encounter started for me when I was a kid. I won't go into all of them, but I had, you know, one of my very, very first memories is with one of these beings. And I had interactions with them until probably I was, at least the ones that I remembered, until I was about 8 years old. Although had you asked me as an adult, young adult, I wouldn't have said that I was an abductee. I didn't know what that was. I had no context for it. They were just, all of those memories were in a strange little box that was up in the closet of my mind somewhere, and that's where they stayed. And it wasn't until I started having conscious physical interactions again, as you know, in my mid-20s, that the neural pathways were established, and like, oh, that's what this is, and this is a continuation, of that. So and I could go into various different, if we had a longer time, I could talk about, the context of my experiences, but I think that fundamentally I'm here to do this work, and that those interactions that I had at that time were a large part of the educational part, of like preparation for the work that I'm doing now. I was also one of the individuals involved with the reproductive program, such as it was, or We Understand It. So there was clearly just some lab rat reasons for them picking me up. One of the natives, it's again not very sexy in that regard. It is what it is. And by the way, Peter, I could relate to your thought about just wanting to kill them, to hurt them, but like in the beginning for me, when it was first happening, I just thought, if you come any closer to me, I will fucking kill you. Like, that's how raw an animal the terror is, and it's very surprising to feel something like that emerge from what is otherwise a very normal, peaceful, kind human being. So all to say, all of these kind of nuances and context are absolutely relevant to getting down to the core, what am I thinking of? Just the core narrative of what this is. And I think getting more information rather than less information is important. And then also connecting all of these disparate collections of information that exist, internationally as well, is absolutely essential. This has to be an international undertaking in order for us to get a clear vision of what it is. So I'm right there with you on it. Yeah. And I'm going to pause for just a minute. I am going to go let the dog out. So I'm going to just turn off my video and I'll be right back.
Okay, we have 20 minutes. This is an incredible discussion. I'm just so impressed because we're getting so much information. This feels like a university. this feels like what a university class could be. This feels like a seriousness that John would really appreciate. And people that have followed my work know that I'm really disappointed because it isn't like this. It's too much for me. My own field is too much of a circus atmosphere or entertainment. And because I have a master's in education and have taught high school I taught high school for 40 years. Everything I do, even in all my work in my books, whether I'm interviewing people like Colonel Corso, Clifford Stone, Robert. I just put Robert Dean on my Facebook. He was amazing. He was NATO, and all of that stuff for me was very serious. It's not any kind of entertainment. So what that's caused me to do for people that are following my Facebook is do more work outside the United States. I just came back from Mexico City and did a lecture there. Plus, I went into the studios of Jaime Maussan and saw material that would never be shown here, incredible material. And for me, and I'm doing a live feed out of Japan on Tuesday. So what for me, my passion, because I get to have 5 minutes here, is to make it international, to do an hour and a half lecture out of Japan, to go to Japan, to go to China, to go to these countries, and to take materials to talk about the phenomena, but most of all, to talk about the fact that it is a raising of human consciousness, that all of the stuff that has been going on is not an accident. It is to get our attention to change something. And if you're working, you want to change something. Otherwise, why would you be doing this? So for my personal assignment that I was given as a journalist, I would like to see some change in my lifetime, and I'm getting older. And I'm not seeing a whole bunch of it in the United States. Yes, Rice University, but it's going to be years before that material is available. And we have this kind of conversation we're having on Zoom right now. It's going to be years before that happens. But I really, really appreciate everybody's support in these master classes where we can bring some of this intellectual data. And in Karin's particular situation, we can really support her. I mean, somebody who leaves their husband for I don't know how many to do this work for John, and she doesn't know when she's going home. It's very important that we support this kind of effort to make this serious, to make to gain something from what he did, to have some archives, to have some clarity, to understand. Because I think the more that we make it serious, the more that we do this as a study, the more it becomes something that is palatable to the outside world. Otherwise, all I see is little gray aliens and everybody wearing silly t-shirts, and that's it. And we don't go anywhere. And nothing changes. And I would like, if this phenomenon was created, and I do believe that this, to change our worldview, to raise us as from a primitive species into some, divine, our divineness, our spirituality, to raise us in some way, and graduate from school, then I think that this is the path that has to go. I'm hoping that the human species eventually graduates, gets to graduation. Otherwise, what's happening is we're stuck in the, where we were, like we're in the Cold War again, which we really are. And I'm looking for an off-ramp on that one, in the Cold War. Go ahead, Julia. Go ahead.
Well, if you really want to move fast, I'd get in. I know Karin was talking about the different disciplines of academics that would get together and integrate their different fields. But I'd suggest looking into at least finding somebody who's a mystic, because when you've got your map of consciousness, you've got, you know, integrity is at 200. You go on up, academia is between 400 and 500 on this 0 to 1,000 map. Academia and you know, Einstein was in there. Above academia is love, which is in the 500s, and that is the place where it's not linear. So if you want to move, if you want to go faster, you have to drop into this space outside of time and space. And I think we're getting a lot of information from the ETs about that. I mean, I think that's where they're asking us to go. So it looks hopeless when you have to do it in a linear way. But if you would, the infusion of the outside time space level, things move in a way different way. And we, you know, it's not a plogging along thing. Things shift. So that's just the insight I had with that. I was like, oh, let's get some of these 500s in there. Let's get some people that are working outside the time space continuum, because it's already done there. You know?
That's literally what we're doing in these side projects with the physicists that we're working with. That we have experiencers who would qualify, you know, as, you know, the mystic, you know, component, and we're working with some pretty straight edge, you know, physicists who, and other academics, but the physicists in particular who are working on these models with us. God bless them. You know, they're being very open-minded and curious, and there's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and working with the whole thing that I was very clear about in reanimating the, you know, John Mack Institute, was that it was essential that experiencers have a seat at the table, you know, so that the knowledge that a lot of us have been incubating for all of these decades is finally, you know, has an opportunity to land in some fertile soil with, you know, mature and dynamically thinking academic and scientific minds, so that we can collaborate to figure out what is, you know, what we're being asked to do here, or what opportunity we have here. And for us, it's really, it seems to be pretty straightforward directives. One, we need to come up with a new model of the universe, which means we need to understand physics differently than what we do. And in understanding how physics actually operates, we'll be able to derive technology that can exploit, you know, the free energy that you know, this electromagnetic gravitational energy that's, you know, pervasive throughout the universe. And as we do that, be able to literally empower the world with a clean energy source that we all need in order to arrest all the damage that we're doing to the biosphere, but also literally to empower all of the human beings who are not empowered right now, you know, and get us off of, not just off of fossil fuel teat, but to be able to finally disempower the centralized governing structures that are really core at you know, the core cause in many ways of how the earth just is being devoured by the commodification of resources that is at the heart of what capitalism is. So our long-term, believe it or not, our meta our meta idea for what we're doing here is to go through the research first, be concurrently developing you know, these, or how do I say it, evolving the relationships with science and academia, so that ultimately we can help develop the technology and therefore really begin this alternate, Paola, you said an off-ramp. That's the word I keep using for it, that we need to create this viable off-ramp for human beings who are just tired of being in the system. And we've made this a not so overwhelming task by just reconciling or coming to terms with the idea that we don't have to persuade 80% or 50% or 40% or 30% of the world. You know, we're not even sure that we have to persuade even 20%. We just need to get enough percentage. It might be 3 to 6% of the human population invested in this new way of living, and that's enough to destabilize the old order and start to pull people over. So this is the thing that we've been dreaming about for, I know it's exciting, right? It's like you get some charge out of it. Like finally, you know, people like rolling up our sleeves and getting to work on it. It's like, all right, if we want to live in this world, then we're the generation that needs to make it happen. And so that's ultimately what we want the John E Mack Institute to be about. That's how we honor who John was and the work that he did. Yeah, very exciting stuff long term.
John,
Yeah.
you send me that map. I've seen the map. It's incredible. It's kind of an inspirational visionary map of what really the reality is and who changes the world. You mentioned mystics. Yes. Well, you send it, and what I'll do is send it to everybody.
Yeah.
Is here.
Well, and it's copyrighted, and they're pretty careful about that. But anybody can look it up. Just put David Hawkins map of consciousness, and you should be able to get it up on the internet. Anybody can access it.
Map of consciousness.
And they.
Diane, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Karin, for all you're doing. I really appreciate that. You had asked why we're here. I happen to know Rudy Shield, who you probably
I know.
and I've had conversations with him regarding where physics is going. And he's, you know, kind of coming to the conclusion, he says that it's all consciousness, but that everything that's being taught in graduate schools today is all wrong. And so there needs to be a shift there. And also with his work with Susie Hansen, the dual soul connection.
One of our advisors.
Great. Yeah. So I just love that book where he made, because he said, as scientists, we need to be curious about this phenomena. There is science here that we need to look at. And like you say, new technologies that can be revealed and so forth. So
yeah, thank you for saying that, for sharing that. A thought that keeps occurring and disappearing is that I'm very much of the camp that which we have considered mystical in the past, and this is going back millennia, so that, you know, I think that humankind has various different explanations for what the ontology is of mystical seeming, you know, phenomena that are related to this, you know, well, at the moment it's related to this phenomenon. But I stand in the camp of what we're really doing is opening up the apertures of our understanding of how the universe actually operates, so that the things that seem mystical to us, or like they might exist in the third realm, are actually natural phenomena of the universe that we're coming into contact with, and we're just developing an understanding of what those things are. And then of course we need to establish a new referential language that everyone agrees on around the planet for what, you know, the different aspects of this, you know, these phenomena are. So it's, to me, it's the science and consciousness are merged in this field. You know, they are inextricably linked. And so I'm wired as as someone who is like, I want to know what this is, but I also want science to be right there with us in it. So we need to reconcile this damaged relationship between science and what we understand as the mystical realm. It's natural phenomenon, and you know, I think we're all somehow innately wired into it, and that is, you know, that's an interesting relationship that we'll get to explore over time as well. Just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I think religion and science got separated at some point.
Yeah.
I'm also a student of Tibetan Buddhism, and if you are familiar with any of the Tibetan lamas and that, I mean, it's so integrated.
Yeah.
They are having these experiences, they teach people how to have these experiences.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone
I
else?
believe John met the Dalai Lama himself.
He did. Yeah, we have pictures.
He did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, they did a movie together. I have the clips from the movie where he's talking to the Dalai Lama. So, yeah, it's very film. Great. Anybody else have a question?
Yes. Well, not a question, but I just wanted to say, somebody mentioned about how we need to get the humanities, that for a string of wonderful opportunities, I was put on the speakers list for Humanities Montana. And one of the things that I do is travel around the state and speak to small, usually libraries and small communities around the state, about my book about Montana UFOs and extraterrestrials. And I begin by talking about this, what I call it is the gliding paradigms, like tectonic plates almost, that are, and the idea that consciousness is primordial is going to win out because there is so much evidence to that effect. I start out with that and talking about Max Planck and how he said that matter doesn't really exist, that its consciousness is primordial a long time ago. And then go on at the end to talk about the positive impacts that are happening to people that have had contact. And that comes from the study that Edgar Mitchell did with FREE, Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Exceptional Experiences. And so I don't know if I could deal with academia. I went and got a PhD in zoology and it damn near killed me, and I'm still in recovery from it.
Yeah, it's dealing with old school academia is it's painful. Like that's not the way. It's like it's railing up against a brick wall. That's not fun.
Yeah.
But there's enough of it, and it probably starts mostly with Gen X, that there's a new generation of thinkers and people who are not as wed to the old paradigm and are curious about emergent, sciences and thinking on new phenomena. Also, over the course of the last 30 years, they haven't made any progress in physics. There are people scientists and physicists who have spent their entire lifetime working, professional lifetime working on these puzzles and have not made significant progress. And so they're aware at this point that they have to start thinking differently. So the people that we're working with are open-minded, open-hearted, curious, and actually a pleasure to be around. The kind of academics that you're talking about, good God, no, I mean, it's exhausting. And I have no interest in that. I have no time for that.
No.
But we don't have time for that, no. So it's either somebody either gets it and wants to explore with us, fantastic. If they're the right fit, then we partner with them. And it's somebody who's arguing with us about it or still poo-pooing it, then God bless you, you're allowed to be there, and we're going to continue on with this work. It's, there are enough qualified and interested academics at this point that we're not reliant on the academics who can't get there, so it's a good time.
What you said about
the irony is that when I had all of this archive of 40 years, University of Colorado would not take it. I thought they should because of 1969, the Condon Committee report, and because the actual Phil DiStefano, who is the head of the university, the president of the university, was my professor. He wanted them to take it, and the library said, no, we're not going to take it. So who has it? And this is incredible because who is talking more about UFOs is the Office of Religious Studies or the Department of Religious Studies. The stuff is in the Department of Religious Studies. Now go wrap your mind around that.
It's humanities.
It's even Diana Pasulka is she's working in the Office of Religious Studies as a professor. So I have to change my mind about what religious studies were, because this is the only way they can frame this stuff is in the religious studies department. If I had a choice, I would have put it in the humanities. I would have put it in at least in psychology or some part of the humanities. Even though that's scientific, I would have put it in the humanities somewhere. But all of our archives are in the in a section that's called Archives of the Impossible. So just that title I love. Archives of the Impossible at Rice University in the Office of Religious Studies. So something has happened. Some shift from regular academia. And the only reason I keep pushing academia is because I really don't think that when other researchers don't read the books of other researchers, I don't know how they can come to any conclusions. And my way of doing research was read everybody's book, whether I liked it or not. I had to read it. So I had 300 books. I just given my whole entire library to a friend of mine, 123 books of all the books that I read, including John's, including even Bud Hopkins and people, I mean, everybody's book. And I find that when I speak to my colleagues, nobody's read anybody's book. So I don't understand how you can get a degree if you only read your own book. So that's why I keep saying that it needs to be academic, not because I like academia, but at least in academics, they give you 20 books to read or something, and then you come to the conclusion that, or you write a paper or you do something based on other people's research and not just your own. And this is what I found, and this is my gripe, Karin knows this. Because any researcher in the world, and I've either met them or read their book. Because, and the reason for that is because I want to know. I just want to know. I'm curious. I want to know. And I can't know if I just did the work. So it's also, when we change the worldview, Karin, I hope we change the methodology that we do research in.
Yeah, for sure. That's what we're intending to do, is to create new methodology and protocols for this. But just to be encouraging, I was invited by Jeff to present to his class. So in class, he's got an experiencer talking about these encounters, and I've been in this for so long. I'm such a veteran of how these kind of interactions typically go, that I know usually that when I give a presentation about, okay, this is what, here's a broad overview of what my experiences were like. And I have a general narrative that I can spit out within about 20 minutes at this point. And I can usually list about the top 7 or 8 counter explanations that a typical listener will come up with, that, well, it was sleep paralysis, or, I'm suffering from narcissistic personality disorder, or there's some other kind of identified, psychopathology, or I have a need to be special, or whatever it is. There's always some, one of those like predictable responses to somebody who's hearing this information for the first time and is trying to make sense of what it must be other than what I'm saying. And for the first time in talking to Jeff's class, so these were mostly grad students, or a couple of undergrads, and a couple of doctoral students in there as well. So the ages would have been somewhere between early 20s and mid 30s. There was not one single answer in that group of students that was in any way sort of reductionistic about what I had gone through. Every one of them, even though they had different takes and thought of it differently as individuals, every single response that they gave was very thoughtful, very nuanced and sophisticated. And it was so encouraging to be in front of that class and realize that this new generation of thinkers is coming up behind us. And it's already starting out from a place of, yes, this is happening. And the question is what is its ontology? So it's not like, no, you're lying, or no, you're not telling the truth. Okay, let's assume you're telling the truth to the best of your ability. Let's figure out what it is. It was the most encouraging interaction that I had with an audience in literally in any of the times that I've ever interacted with an audience after giving a talk about my encounters. So I think we have a reason to be hopeful about the future. The question is how much work can we do in our lifetime so that we get to benefit it all from this evolution of human consciousness that we're on, we're in the early throes of. Really quickly, Joan, I know you had one last thought that was trailing. I heard you start to say it, and then also Peg, I saw your hand as well. So I just want to make sure we get to both of you before we sign off.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Joan, do you want to finish your thought real quick?
Thank you. What you said about love really is very important to me. So when I speak, and particularly when I spoke the first time at the International UFO Congress, it was very important to me that I broadcast love in the way that I talked about people and in my tone of voice, that I wanted that, I wanted somehow to imbue that.
Mm.
And I had a guy stop me on the way back to an interview that time, pulled me over. He said that he and his friend were both ex-CIA.
Yes.
He said, I loved listening to you. I didn't want you to stop talking. And I thought, I bet in the CIA, there's not a lot of loving. And maybe he was a little starved to get that. But
Yeah.
it was so affirming to me that that's such an important piece of it, because that's one of the main communications that they are trying to get to us.
Yes, I agree entirely. Yeah, we have to move into our hearts and express that as empathy and compassion, first for ourselves, then for our fellow human beings, and for the planet, for the biosphere, all living things on the planet. After that, it will follow. So it's very difficult to have a positive, loving relationship with the biosphere and be inclined to preserve it when we are operating from a paradigm that says everything is separate, that, you know, nothing is connected. And this idea, this emergent model for the universe that suggests that everything is already literally fundamentally connected in the universe, creates this different lens for us to look through and experience ourselves as fundamentally connected. So if we can have that shift of understanding about how the universe operates, which will then mirror back to us that, okay, so we are actually connected to our next door neighbor who we don't actually agree with politically or otherwise, and that we need to, through warmth, through compassion and empathy, find a way to feel our connection in a healthy way to that individual. That's the shift of consciousness happening at the same time. And mind you, I don't think we're going to be able to do this in a unicorn and cotton candy kind of way. I think we're headed for a lot of mess. I think that stuff is going to break down and get, I think it'll be painful for a lot of people while we're going through the shift. This is not going to, happen in a nice, fluid, new agey kind of way. That this process of breakdown, destruction is usually pretty messy before something is rebuilt. So just so you guys know, I don't have a Pollyanna-ish view of how this is going to go down. We just know that we need to create a new model that's functional, that attracts people, and it emerges out of this knowledge and wisdom that we've all been sort of allowing to incubate and emerge within us, over the past few decades. So I appreciate that. I resonate with what you're saying, Joan.
I'm with you. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. And Peg?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. I'm feeling quite vulnerable right at the moment. It's I'm an old lady now, and want to be quiet and not in the limelight at all. That said, I loved John Mack, and he and I connected doing the Stanislav Grof holotropic breath work. And I was intrigued by these giant brains that would have exchanges in the breathwork circle over the weekends, over the weeks. I think they were week-long. And John's story of inviting Harvard, I don't know whether I have this correct, but Harvard inviting Russian psychiatrists, and John arranging a holotropic breath work with these psychiatrists. And they were so profoundly moved by this. Many of them were changed and couldn't go back to hardcore psychiatry. And I never could. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's I can't think of the term for it, but I don't want to say that. What I want to say is I connected with John. It was a heart connection because I got no credentials at all, and often would say to myself, what does John Mack want to be with me for? But he did, and he and I went up to Roscoe, New York, to meet with Ken Wapnick, who is, in my opinion, the consummate teacher of A Course in Miracles, which I have been looking at for many years. And John and I, at Ken's invitation, drove up to Roscoe, New York in the Adirondacks, and from Massachusetts. And Ken and John met for lunch, and then we met afterwards again. But John was so flustered by what I have come to think that something was being touched by within John by the principles of A Course in Miracles. But I don't know. Anyway, that leads me to say I have long been interested in death and dying from the time of a small child, and and therefore mediumship has been a long interest of mine. And after John died, I went to a Universalist church or spiritual church where part of the service is contacting people who are on the other side of the veil. And I knew John's interest in this. And I thought to myself, I really want to contact John. And so I went to this spiritualist church, and nothing happened. But it's been in my mind, and I have long wanted to be a medium. And I'm thinking now, particularly after this evening with you guys, and the work you're doing, if it was possible for me to make a contact with John through the veil, and I think anything is possible. So just to put it out in the ether, I'm going to proceed with this work. I feel inspired after this evening. Maybe why not me be a spokesman for whatever new teachings he might have, or might want to say about the UFO process. I don't know, but I'm curious and inspired. And these are two feelings that I have longed to feel in the last few years. And I'm not griping about old age, but let it be said that I don't like it much.
Yeah, I don't like it much either. Yeah, how beautiful. You've made it all worthwhile. And Karin, from the heart, thank you so much for your time from the heart.
welcome.
To everybody that's here, everyone that's here, if you want a copy of this master class, text email me and I'll send it to you with WeTransfer, okay?
Great.
Yeah, and please, and you can share it. I mean, you can. It's going to go on my Patreon, because all the people that support my work are getting it too. But it's so important to share these things, and since we can't physically, I mean, we've got Montana, we've got British Columbia, we've got Houston, we've got Australia. It is a beautiful model for a dialogue. So if you want a copy of this, email me right away and I'll WeTransfer it to you. But and I'll give a copy to you too, Karin, because I think this is this thing about the way that we approached John and his work and all the people that knew him could be of service even to Rice University. I mean, they could go and watch the video because these are people that knew him. So yeah, so can I thank you very much for everything? It's a little over 2 hours. And just thank you for being here and thank you for doing it. And it is inspirational, Peg. You're right. It helps us all keep going and doing, because he affected like all of us and so many that we haven't even, we can't even imagine. So I'm going to close the recording part of this.